All right. Um, Welcome to Lecture 1. This is an introduction to a basic conversation about what philosophy is. Um, and what we first want to start off with is recognizing that when it comes to Western philosophy, it's conventionally traced back to the ancient Greeks. I say conventionally because there are some of us out there who recognize that the ancient Greeks were in turn influenced by the Egyptians, who were in turn probably influenced by the Mesopotamians from the Middle East, the Assyrians, um, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Akkadians. But it's not really, something that is conventionally agreed to by various experts in the field. So, as a general rule, when it comes to studying Western philosophy, they just trace it back to the ancient Greeks. Um, you know, there are some who can uh, make arguments that the tradition only goes to the Greeks because of certain cultural biases in terms of having to admit that Egypt and Mesopotamia, both of which are presences in the Middle East, um, you know, would have been such a formative influence on what later became a European and Western and American tradition. But that's neither here nor there. We're not here to um, really kind of debate that or examine that in any depth. So, for the sake of convention, we'll begin with the ancient Greeks. So, Socrates, who's referred to as the the father of Western philosophy, he always said that philosophy begins with thaumazein, which is a Greek word referring to a sense of wonder or a curiosity about the world. And so, what Socrates is suggesting is that, you know, philosophy, um, the discipline that really kind of began our search for knowledge and understanding, is something born within human beings, um, particularly from our natural curiosity, our sense of wonder. As you can see in the pictures here, the I have an infant or a toddler, and then another small child, and in both senses we see a sense of curiosity or wonder. Right, the one on the left is curious about the flower, its colors, its texture, what it is. As human beings, this is how we explore the world around us. We're hardwired for it. Any of you that have babies around you or have had babies around you in the past, you know that the way that the way that we're hardwired as human beings is we're pulled into the world from inside of our own head through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. Um, this is why we create like mobiles hanging over a crib that are colorful with lights and music so that it pulls the child out, and entertains them, right? By the time we get to this older, toddler, kindergarten stage, they start to kind of mess with the world around them. Here, he's curious about the dog's genitals, obviously, and he's probably about to start discovering genitals and sexual organs by looking at animals. Um, so the those of you that have been around small children, you know that they love to ask questions, right? They come at you, asking you, you bring somebody new by, they hang on to this new person and bombard them with questions. Who are you? Why are you here? Are you dating, my brother or my sister? Um, what do you, that you they what do you do, or what do you do for fun? And then after that, they start with the questions of why. Why does this happen? Why is the sky blue? Why do you have to work? Why can't you spend time with me? And so on. And the point I'm trying to make is that by looking at children and babies, we begin to see what kind of Socrates is referring to, right? The sense of wonder, the curiosity. We have questions as human beings. We try to make sense of the world around us, and this is where philosophy is born, right? So what Socrates is getting at is this idea of asking questions that arises from our thaumazein or our wonder or our curiosity is what leads to the practice of philosophy itself. You have to remember that, philosophy is originally a Greek word. It comes from philein or philia, which means love, and from the word sophia, which means wisdom. So philosophia means love of wisdom, right? And so for Socrates and for the ancient Greeks, right, the practice of philosophy is the asking of questions for the purpose of trying to gain wisdom out of a love for wisdom, a love for knowledge, a love for asking questions and getting to the bottom of things. Now, what separates philosophy from other subjects um, is one of the things that does that is that philosophy, in the attempt to answer these questions that come out of thaumazein or wonder, is that when we arrive at these answers, we have to back up those answers through reason and argument that relies on factual evidence. And so this is one of the things that separates, for example, philosophy from other things like, for example, conspiracy theory on the internet, right? Or people who practice other things like spirituality, right? And some of those things with like the New Age thoughts. I know that sometimes the bookstores would put philosophy right next to like spirituality or next to quote unquote metaphysics, and we'll talk about that in a second and why that's a misuse in those bookstores. But you know, one of the things that's happening is that in philosophy, instead of like conspiracy theory or instead of um, you know some of what's going on online, or instead of some of the stuff that happens with the spirituality in the New Age, or even like the psychology self-help stuff, is that philosophy has to rely on reason and argument that depends on factual evidence. So if you cannot provide factual evidence to support your argument, then you have no argument. If your argument is not rational, then you have no argument either, right? This is not about emotions. This is not about what you wish. It's not about wish fulfillment. It's not about what you would rather be true about the world around you. It's about having factual evidence. And one of the questions that we are gonna like struggle with is what exactly is factual evidence, right? That in itself is a debate unto itself. What can we trust, right? And this kind of brings us into some of those subjects of philosophy. It is important to note that the uh, the discipline of philosophy was the original subject that gave rise to all the other subjects that you're taking classes in college and university. And what I mean by that is that Aristotle made it very clear. We'll learn about Aristotle later as well. Aristotle made it very clear that philosophy was the mother of science. And this is true historically as well as intellectually. And what Aristotle means by that is that what we call science today, right? Biology, astronomy, botany, chemistry, physics, those subjects in science, right, only exist because we first started asking questions in the first place as a part of philosophy, right? Philosophy got us to ask the big questions that eventually led to the answers that created these subjects called biology, astronomy, physics, and chemistry. It's we only have these sciences because philosophy asked those questions in the first place. What is the world? What is the universe? How does it work? Why is there something instead of nothing? How did we get here? So these types of questions that philosophy asked at the beginning, what we call the big questions, eventually led thinkers towards what we now call the sciences, right? They started formulating answers and then testing those answers. Some answers wound up being proven better than other answers. And eventually, those answers and these questions kind of led to what we call the scientific method, right? Somewhere around the beginning of the modern period, in the Renaissance and the early age of enlightenment, with people like Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton. One of the things about them is they were not called scientists back then when they were alive. They were called natural philosophers because they were philosophers who focused on nature. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture. Um, if you'll just kind of wait for it. So coming back to the topic of philosophy, right? The nature of the questions you ask in philosophy affects which branch of philosophy you engage in. There are a number of branches of philosophy, and you have them listed right here. So, for example, ethics has to do with the study of morality, the study of right and wrong, the study of good and evil, the idea of choices and responsibility. Um, we'll be examining several of these as we move through the course, but ethics isn't just a matter of figuring out what good or evil are, or what makes something right or what makes something wrong, right? It's something that ends up being applied to very specific situations. For example, there's like the ethics of medicine, there's the ethics of invention, there's business ethics, there's legal ethics, there's the ethics of education, and so on. So once you like dig into ethics, um, and you cover it on an abstract philosophical level, eventually that winds up kind of breaking down into like more specific subjects, so that you wind up looking at the ethical implications of some of these things that we do in the real world. So ethics has very much a lot of practical applications. Um, the next one, in terms of the branches of philosophy, is what we call political philosophy or political theory. So when we talk about politics here in this class, we are definitely not talking about you know Republicans and Democrats, and Trump or Biden or Clinton, or any of those types of things. That's not what this course is interested in. This course is interested more in political theory, the study of political organizations, the idea of what should the powers of government be, what should the limits of government be, what are the rights and duties of citizens, what's the relationship between government and citizens. So those are some of the abstract questions, but of course, then we get into some of the more specific things, like, for example, what form of government is the best form of government, right? What do we even mean by the best form of government? What are we measuring it by? Should we have totalitarianism, right? Where you have one dictator in charge of everything in people's lives? Should we have absolute freedom in the form of anarchy? Should we have limited freedom in the form of democracy? So there are many different types of political organizations or political structures, and there's a political theory to try to justify each of those, um, in terms of political theory, and we'll dig into some of that throughout this course. The next subject is what's called aesthetics. Aesthetics is the study of beauty or art, the study of literature and other areas of taste and meaning. So, in other words, what is beauty? What is beautiful? Who determines what is beautiful? Is beauty in the eye of the beholder, or are there such things as standards of beauty, right? Um, what exactly is art? Why do humans make art in the first place? Why do we love stories so much? Why do we create literature? Is poetry dead, right? Those types of questions are questions of aesthetics. Um, Physics is a branch of philosophy that studies the material objects and their motions through space. That is literally the definition Aristotle created for the word physics. He coined the word physics in terms of how we mean it now as a discipline, from the Greek physis. So, physics is the study of material objects as they move through space and as they have existence across time. So, in fact, the first book on physics was literally called Physics and was written by Aristotle, who we'll talk about later. Um, and from physics, we move on to metaphysics. Now, I mentioned this before. In some bookstores, you go look for a book a book in a section called metaphysics, and what you'll run into there usually is books like what we call New Age books or books on spirituality, right? Books about um, you know crystals and spirits and astral projection and reincarnation and things like that. When we talk about metaphysics in this class, that is not what we are referring to. Aristotle defines metaphysics as the study of the first principles or the foundational building blocks of the universe itself. So, if physics is trying to understand, you know, material objects and their motion through space and their existence across time, metaphysics is trying to understand what is space, what is time, right? How did the universe get created? Um, what is the mind when we talk about the human mind? Is there a soul, right? Those are some of the issues that metaphysics kind of addresses. Are human beings free to make choices, or are they programmed by cause and effect? So, physics is more like the science that you normally think of. Metaphysics, in terms of like studying physical objects in space and time. Metaphysics is trying to understand those basic things that you need to understand physics, like space and like time. Um, the next one, which is kind of connected to those other two, is called ontology, right? Ontology is the study of reality itself. What is reality? What does it mean to be real, right? And some of you may think that's a kind of getting out of hand, perhaps in terms of subjects to study in a class in college. But what we're trying to get you to think about is what do we mean by real, right? Um, are only physical things you can touch real? It, you can't touch God. You can't touch unicorns. You can't touch freedom. You can't touch justice, right? Does that mean that we want to say that those are not real? There is no justice since we can't see it, smell it, taste it, touch it. Do we know? Do we want to believe that there is no such thing as freedom or free will because we can't see or touch those things because they're not physical in the normal sense? So, exactly do we mean by real? Are there degrees of reality, right? So that's what we mean by ontology. The next subject that we have listed here is cosmology, right? Um, Cosmology is the study of how the universe began. Most people right now believe in the Big Bang Theory in terms of science, right? In terms of astronomical cosmology. That is not the only theory that is floating around out there about how the universe was created. And I'm not just talking about the Bible with creationism. Even amongst scientists, there are other theories out there, and we'll look at a couple of them throughout the semester. Um, for example, the oscillating theory of the universe, otherwise known as the rubber band theory, right? This idea that universes are come and go. The multiverse theory is another one. I'm sure some of you Marvel fans and DC fans out there have thought about that one. The next subject, in terms of branches of philosophy, is called theology. This is the study of religion and the study of divinity, right? Is there a God? Can you prove that God exists? Can you prove that there is no God? If there is a God, what is that God exactly? What is that God like? What is the relationship between that God and the people that God created, right? These are theological questions. What happens after you die? Is there an afterlife? Is there judgment? Is there reincarnation? Those are theological questions that are asked, and we'll look at a little bit of that as well. And then the last um, branch of philosophy that we're going to talk about today is epistemology, right? The study of how the mind generates ideas, the study of knowledge versus opinion, knowledge versus belief, and knowledge versus ignorance. And the key here is since we are trapped inside our own heads, how do we know that we know, right? And the big question is, how do you know the difference between a belief and knowledge? Um, some of you may think that that's a very obvious question in terms of an answer for it, but if you think about it, one of the things we're going to kind of examine is the fact that like you are certain about certain things inside your mind. And the fact is, when we pull your emotional component out of the equation, what we realize is that you feel just as certain about things that are actually beliefs as you feel certain about things that are actual knowledge, right? Um, some people are, as sure that there is a God as they are sure that there is a thing called gravity that can be proven by dropping objects onto the floor. Um, some people are convinced that, um, you know, their political party are the good guys and the other political party are the bad guys, as clearly and certainly as they are about, let's say that the sun will rise tomorrow or that they went to work earlier today. So, certainty is something we're going to be looking at throughout the semester as well. What exactly can we say we are certain of in the real sense of the word, as in we can corroborate it with external evidence instead of just a feeling of certainty, which is a feeling. And we'll talk about that in more detail later in the semester. So, again, these are various branches of philosophy, right? Like if you got a degree in philosophy, when you got to grad school in a master's or PhD program, you would start to narrow down which of these you want to kind of study and become an expert at, right? Um, Now, these these are defined by these branches are defined by the types of questions you're asking, right? The kinds of questions you ask affect which kind of philosophy you're doing. However, the way you answer those questions creates what we call schools of thought, right? So within ethics, there are various schools of thought. Within metaphysics, there are various schools of thought. Within political theory, there are various schools of thought, right? And those are the more common ones that you're probably more familiar with, right? In political theory, how you answer the question about the relationship between citizens and government, or what kind of government is the best form of government, the way you answer that is going to make a certain type of school of thought that you're a part of. So, for example, you have your anarchists, you have your monarchists, you have your socialists, you have your pro-democracy people, you have your pro-totalitarian or your pro-dictatorship or your pro-autocracy people. Um, and so those different political groups, right? Like when you read the news about Antifa versus white supremacists or whatever, um, or Republicans versus Democrats, or communists versus fascists, or whatever the case may be, right? Those are political schools of thought, right? Or economic schools of thought, depending on which ones you go with. So they're answering the questions of political theory in a particular way. Now, some of these other schools of thought that you might not be as familiar with are the ones that I have listed on here, right? So, for example, objectivism is basically a school of thought where there's a, there's a belief in um, universally binding truths and values. Um, Hold on a second, little technical difficulty there. There we go. So an objectivist believes that there are truths and values that are, how should I put this? They exist outside human minds. Like there is a truth that is out there, whether we know it or not, right? That there are values like justice and courage and the good that really do exist, even if no humans existed, right? Even if there were no people around to figure out the truth would still be there, right? They would that these truths and values exist independently and externally and universally. That there is only one way, one truth, one life, right? And I bring up, that quote. Some of you may be familiar with it because the way, the truth, and the life, right? That's a reference to Jesus and Christianity. And the reason I'm bringing that up here under objectivism is because, certain religions tend to be an example of objectivism, right? People like the Christians, the Jewish people, and the Muslims, right? They're an example, and we'll talk about them in some detail later. They're an example of religions that are objectivist. They believe there is one God, that God believes that, knows the truth about reality because that God created reality, right? And whether we want to accept that God's truth or not has nothing to do with anything because the truth is the truth, right? Now, religions are not the only ones that can be objectivist. Um, scientists, certain types, most scientists are some type of objectivist, right? They believe that the universe has certain truths about it, like gravity, um, like the electromagnetic spectrum, that these external physical realities are true, whether we understand them or not, whether we can give equations to be able to predict the behavior or not yet, that truth is already there. And so scientists are a form of objectivism many times, not always, just like not all religions are objectivist, but there's a significant portion of the scientists and there's a significant portion of the religious that are objectivists because they believe in this truth that is independent of human minds. So that's kind of an example of that, right? Um, the next one, and we'll come back to some of these. So I'm just kind of running through them, somewhat, uh, you know, to introduce them to you a little bit. Um, so relativism is the school of thought that argues that values and truth exist relative to the society, the tradition, or the majority that you live in, right? So, what is true in, let's say, uh, Houston, Texas, is not necessarily what's true in the Inuit culture of northern Canada, which is not necessarily the same truth as what's true in, let's say, the Taliban controlled Afghanistan, which is not necessarily the same as what's true amongst, um, a particular um, tribe of people in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So, in relativism, the idea is that each culture has its own truth, its own value, its own reality, right? So those of you that are like multicultural, right, where you believe in respecting each culture, that's a form of relativism. Those of you that think that no, there's only one truth and that everybody else is wrong, however, you would be an objectivist, which we just talked about. Then there's subjectivism, right? Subjectivism argues that truth and value are a matter of personal experience or personal opinion. Those of you who are like to each their own, we're just going to agree to disagree. I have my own reality, you have your own reality. That is called subjectivism. And there are philosophers who do promote that, and we're going to cover one of them later in the semester. Um, then there's what we call positivism. Positivism basically is might makes right, right? Power determines truth. Whoever has more people believing it, whoever has more guns, whoever's more persuasive, whoever's richer, whoever has more political power, right? Those in control are the ones who decide what is and what is not for everybody else, right? Whether through violence or politics or through money or through media or whatever the case. So if you believe that like the whole point of power is so you can define reality for yourself and everybody around you, then you, my friend, are a positivist, right? Then there's the nihilist, right? The nihilist can mean many things, and there's all kinds of debates, even amongst nihilists, about what nihilism is. But in simple terms, right? Nihilism argues that there are no truths or values. That truths and values are fictions created by people to control themselves and one another. Um, so in those of you that love Russian fiction, right? If you've read Dostoevsky, Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great novelist, One of his novels, one of the characters says, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted." And so that is a form of nihilism, right? Um, you know, there, this idea that, you know, we exist as animals, we live, we die, and we cease to exist. Therefore, I'm going to do what I want when I want. That's a form of nihilism. Um, the next kind of school of thought that we have is called skepticism. Right? Skepticism means to systematically doubt everything and accept only what has proven itself. So if you doubt things until they are proven, that's a skeptic, right? You're a skeptic. Um, in a lot of ways, science is skeptical because it created the scientific method and the idea of reproducible experiments that should result with the same results. They created that as, to address doubt, right? Because they don't believe in it until you can prove it to them scientifically through reproducible experiments. So there is a certain element of skepticism in science as well. Um, the next form of thought is what we call solipsism, right? Um, solipsism is this idea that inside your mind, you as a mind can only be certain of your own existence as a mind. And after that, as far as you know, you're just a mind floating in an empty void, and the universe and everybody else are just illusions that you create for yourself for the purposes of not going crazy or for entertainment purposes, right? So a solipsist is a person who thinks only they are real and the rest of us, are just a figment of their imagination, right? That's a form of solipsism. You see there in the picture, right? There's just this, solitary figure existing in a black void, right? And walking into a doorway of a universe that they're creating for themselves. Something similar to that is idealism. In idealism, um, they believe that only minds exist, right? Not just theirs, but all minds. So my mind, your mind, exist in, and we kind of communicate with each other and create a universe together through our minds. And that universe that we are looking in and living in and hearing in, right, is something that we've created together as a community of minds, right? So the physical universe is basically not real, right? Only minds are real. Only ideas are real. Uh, George Berkeley is a philosopher who's an idealist, and his famous quote has always been, "To be is to be perceived." Right. So in other words, if a mind cannot, is not perceiving it, then it isn't there. It doesn't exist. Right. Um, the opposite of that would be materialism. Materialism believes there are no minds, there are no ideas, there's only physical bodies in a material universe. Basically, human beings are complex meat robots at the mercy of cause and effect. Again, this is science in many ways, right? Certain types of scientists believe, medical scientists, for example, believe that we are physical bodies, and if you understand cause and effect, then you can affect things. This is why they run tests to figure out what's wrong with you, and then from there, they come up with some way of affecting what's causing the disease or the illness or the syndrome or whatever the case may be. That's a form of materialism, right? Are we just, flesh mechanisms that are part of a bigger machine called the universe? That would be a materialist. So here, materialism has nothing to do with money. Idealism has nothing to do with being naive, right? Idealism and materialism have to do with our minds or bodies, the real thing, right? And if you believe in both, then you're what's called a dualist, right? Um, but that's a conversation we'll come back to later. Um, when it comes to religion, all right, religion, the first one that we have here is atheism. Atheism basically argues that there are no gods, there are no souls, there are no afterlives, nothing spiritual is real, right? So an atheist believes in no God and no soul, and no heaven and no hell, and no reincarnation. For an atheist, we are just animals, and we live in a physical universe. Usually, atheists are also materialists, right? But not all materialists are atheists. So, you know, the, these different schools of thought, sometimes they pair with each other in certain ways, but not in other ways. Monotheism, however, is one that I'm sure so many of you are probably more familiar with because it's the more common one in our culture. But that's quickly changing as we get other members from other cultures kind of joining us in the U.S. But monotheism is the belief that there is only one God, right? I put the symbols there. The first one is the Star of David. That's from the Jewish religion. Then there's the cross from the Christians. And then there's the star and the moon. That's from the Muslims. I put those there because those are like the three, largest in terms of the amount of people that believe in them around the world. Those are the three largest monotheistic religions, right? They all believe there's only one God. Yahweh for the Jewish, Jesus/Jehovah for the Christians, and then Allah for the Muslims, right? There's just one. Um, Deism is another kind of religious belief. Basically, it believes that God created the universe as a machine that could run itself and then left it to run itself, right? So, back in the 17 and early 1800s, there were a lot of science based um, Freemasons. I don't know if you know about the Freemasons, but back in the 17 and 1800s, the Freemasons, a lot of whom were scientists, they believed in God, but they believed in a deistic God, right? They believed that the God had created this kind of self-running clock, basically the universe, wound it up, got it going, and then backed off, right? So a deist believes in God but would not believe in miracles, for example. There's no point in praying if you're a deist because you God doesn't answer, right? He, she, it, they created the universe and then kind of walked away. That's kind of a deist. And you see that here in the picture, right? There's this idea of this shadowy God kind of like looking over but not really doing much about it. Another kind of religious view is what's called polytheism. Polytheism is basically that there's more than one god or goddess, right? So those of you that love your, what's the Rick Riordan book series, right? With the kid with the lightning thief and all that. You might be remembering the Greek myths, right? In Greek mythology, they had more than one god. They had Zeus and Athena, Aphrodite, Ares, Hephaestus, and so on. So that would be polytheism. Um, the religions that are still around today that are polytheistic, the big one is Hinduism in India, right? In Hinduism, you have Brahma and Vishnu and Shiva and Krishna and many other gods and goddesses. Kali, right? So those are like that's a polytheistic religion. Hinduism is also the next one. They are also pantheistic, right? Pantheism is the idea that everything is God and God is everything. So in Hinduism, the universe is Brahma, right? And Brahma is the universe. That's a form of pantheism. So what does that mean? I'm a part of God, you're a part of God, this computer's a part of God, the room around me is a part of God, and so on and so forth, right? So pantheism is this idea that all of us are a part of God itself. Um, and so these are some of the religious beliefs that are out there. Um, and so even since this is the first lecture on philosophy, I wanted to show you the branches of philosophy and the schools of thought, just to kind of show you how many different varieties of thought there are out there. And here at the school, each of these can have their own course, right? So like theology can lead to a philosophy of religion class. Ethics leads to like an introduction to ethics class, um, and so on. So, hopefully, if you enjoy this class and you decide to maybe get a philosophy major or philosophy minor, um, then you can kind of go explore these in a lot more depth. We will be introduced to some of these in the course, but there's no way we could cover all of them in just 12 to 16 weeks. So this is just kind of a quick kind of rundown of what philosophy is, right? In conclusion, philosophy, according to Socrates, comes up from curiosity and a sense of wonder. It relies on the asking of questions and the use of reason to try to construct logical arguments that rely on factual evidence. These types of questions can give rise to different branches of philosophy, different branches of science, and the way you answer those questions creates different schools of thought. Um, so, hopefully, you took notes, and I will see you in the next lecture.